Awesome. Well, great to see lots of you. Welcome and a good evening again. I see lots of veterinarians here. That's awesome. Some other advisors, nutritionists, field reps, a couple of industry representatives as well. Awesome. Well, thanks very much. Again, really excited about this. So without further ado, I'm gonna jump in here. And if you do have any technical issues, anything at all, please pop that in the chat, and Vicky or a member of the Lactanet team here will be happy to assist you and get you set up. So our goals and objectives for this session are really to help you, dairy advisors across Canada, to understand the new code of practice for the care and handling of dairy cattle, and ultimately, as I said in my introductory comments, how to support on-farm implementation. So we're going to go through some of the major changes, some of the opportunities for discussion as an advisor on farm, and I'll try to again hit on some of your key questions as we go. But please do chime in with your questions by chat as we go forward. What I'm going to attempt to answer in 2 hours, and that's not a lot of time when you consider the breadth and depth of the code, is talk a little bit about how and why the code was updated. I'll be brief in my comments around this, but we're really going to dig much more into what's changed with the code. I want to briefly and where relevant talk about the why and the science behind key changes. I'm not going to offer a ton of detail, but I'm certainly going to touch on some of those pieces that I believe are important for us in bringing the why to our producers. How to approach clients about key changes. I actually want us collectively to be talking about that. So there's going to be a couple opportunities for some breakout discussions. I'm going to put you in a room with a few of your peers, and I want you discussing some of these topics, as well as where you can go for resources. And of course, as I've said already, trying to integrate and answer your questions as we go forward. So let's talk about the code and of course, the important links to ProAction. So I want to talk about process, status, and expectations here. So a couple of things. On the right-hand side, this is what our code of practice looks like. If you haven't looked at it here, it's quite accessible online in both English and French as PDFs, as HTML options. It's very easy to search and navigate. And as we move forward here, I believe our Lactanet colleagues will offer up. There we are. Thanks, Brooke. A couple of direct links, so you can see in the chat there a link to the English and French versions of the code. So please do check those out if you have not already. So I'm going to take the sort of who, why, what, where, when, how approach to the code just to give you the basics. The Dairy Farmers of Canada were responsible for initiating the update of the code. They initiated the code with the National Farm Animal Care Council, NFAC. NFAC is the one that manages and unfolds the process for the codes in Canada at the request of any particular commodity group. The code is ultimately, and hopefully many of you will be aware of this, providing critical guidance for the care and handling of, in this case, dairy cattle. It's meant to serve as the basis or the Bible, really, for our national understanding of animal care requirements and recommended practices. And those two pieces are particularly important to understand because they have important ramifications around expectations in the industry. And I'll unfold that more in a moment. Why did the Dairy Farmers of Canada initiate this? Well, first off, they wanted to follow NFAC's process of reviewing a code every 5 years and revising a code every 10 years. This is really about making sure that the code reflects the latest science, practices, and stakeholder expectations. And that will be extending everything from farmer to citizen or consumer, and everyone in between. All of those interests are considered as part of the code revision process. When we consider the when, where I want you to understand first and foremost that the updated code came into effect in April 1st of 2024. What you see in brackets is particularly important, unless the requirements were otherwise stated. And so I'm going to talk about a few requirements, and many of you will be aware of this because I believe DFC and industry collectively have done a pretty good job at communicating about the changes. This is ultimately going to replace the 2009 code. So as an entire document, this became our foundational document, our guiding light for animal care when it came on April 1st of 2024. But there are a couple of key requirements that have a later implementation date. Now, again, I'll unpack that for you as we move forward. This simply applies to all Canadian dairy farms. And how this process unfolded or how this code came to be was a multi-stakeholder code development committee. So I'll show you what types of individuals sat on that in a moment. But their job was to, over quite a lengthy process and period of time, engage in facilitated consensus-based approaches to develop The code. They were informed by a separate scientific committee. I was part of that as a scientific writer. There were a variety of other academics that sat on that group, and their job was ultimately to, as I said before, synthesize this science on a couple of key priority welfare issues and offer that back to the code development committee. The draft code was also submitted for public consultation, and so anyone and everyone had the opportunity to offer feedback, which the code development committee then must review, consider, and modify the code based on that feedback. The code itself represents discussions between a variety of different stakeholders, from farmers to many members of the representatives of the types of advisors we have in this room today, veterinarians, namely being, of course, a crucial one when it comes to health and welfare. But we had transport professionals, animal care experts, members of the ProAction and Dairy Farmers of Canada team, animal welfare advocacy associations, provincial animal protection authorities. We had retail, restaurant, and food service organizations represented, of course, dairy processors. We had government there as well, and animal welfare researchers and academics. They were brought in through the scientific committee, as well as provincial government representatives. So they really do try to make a concerted effort to make sure they have a variety of stakeholders represented at the table to help make these decisions. I've talked about the scientific committee a couple of times. I won't belabor it here. The job of the scientific committee, as mandated, is ultimately to come up with a list of up to six priority welfare issues. This is not just agreed by the scientific committee or the names that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. It is also input is also provided by the code development committee itself. And there's a specific set of criteria that need to be evaluated and considered before we can consider an issue a priority issue. Namely, do we have enough science? And in this case, because we were updating a code, the question became, do we have enough new science since 2009 that actually warrants us reviewing this particular topic? And is it of a high relevance to the code? The topics that were decided through this process were cow-calf separation, optimal management or design of indoor systems. So that's a big one. Pain control, lameness and injuries, and end of life management. So those were the specific issues. This is a publicly available document. The links are now in your chat in both English and French. You can navigate to them and you can review all of the summaries that have been provided there. It is a very technical document. It's meant to be very much so a synthesis of the science. And again, it was presented to and laid at the feet of the Code Development Committee to then consider as part of their discussions. So I talked before about the importance of language around requirements and recommended practices. I'm going to unpack that for you here, and then we can get a little bit more into the what in terms of changes. When I say requirement in the context of the code, I'm talking to either a regulatory or an industry imposed expectation outlining acceptable and unacceptable practices. In short, requirements are requirements. We expect Canadian dairy farmers to follow and abide by requirements by the dates set. How do we do that? Well, that's where we really see a linkage to ProAction. The Dairy Farmers of Canada, as the industry representative that engaged or initiated this process, makes a commitment to incorporate, in this case, the new code requirements into ProAction. So we see this exact type of process unfold for the other commodity groups where they would use their quality assurance program, verify beef production plus, for example, in the beef code, making commitments around how they're going to actually create an accountability framework around implementation of those requirements set out in the code. But of course, we know that there's a lot of things that we as an industry may not be prepared to mandate for one of a variety of reasons. We would consider these to be recommended practices. In the code, this is referring to practices that can further enhance animal welfare outcomes, but the failure to actually implement them does not imply that acceptable standards aren't being met. It's really trying to exceed or to demonstrate what BMPs or best management practices look like in the context of a particular topic. So I'm going to come back to that requirements and recommended practices a number of times. A couple of other things that I want to share with you. I think this might be relevant for some of you that are going to spend a lot of time on farm is understanding how is this actually going to be integrated into ProAction and where are we at? So the ProAction team has developed technical committees around each major module of ProAction. So AC stands for animal care, FS food safety, bio being biosecurity. These three technical committees have taken on reviewing the code requirements and considering, based on what we have in ProAction today, what additional or what modifications need to be made in order to actually implement the code requirements into ProAction. They felt it's not enough to simply just make some tweaks, make some changes, and say, okay, this is what's expected now of all Canadian dairy farmers. They want to ensure that this is both practical, achievable, and makes sense. And so they're running an on-farm pilot with a sample of farms, very similar to the way ProAction standards or requirements have been established in other modules. And they're going to pilot this with a sample of farms across the country this winter, so December to March specifically. Following the pilot, DFC is going to do a couple of things. They're going to analyze the feedback they receive from all parties involved. They're going to adjust and finalize those requirements based on that feedback. Then they're going to go through a period of communication, changes, what changes are being made. And of course, this is going to go out to farmers and industry more broadly. So you as advisors are going to be major recipients of this information, of course. And then they're going to look to implement this in on-farm validations. Okay. So this work is still very much being undertaken right now. The important piece is the planned implementation date in ProAction is April of 2027. So they're giving themselves time to manage and prepare for these changes. They're allowing time for this work and these discussions to take place, to adjust to all related farmer, validator, and assessor tools and training. Because as you can appreciate, they can't just implement a change in a workbook. They need to make sure everyone's aware of it. They need to make sure people are briefed on how to assess it or validate it in the case of assessors and validators, respectively. And of course, they need farmers, they need their advisors to understand what the expectations and what the changes are. So the target here, as you see in the bottom bullet, is that they're looking for at least 6 months notice for everyone to understand this is what's coming, this is the expectation, and they want to make sure that, of course, they align with future dates for other requirements in the code. And I'm going to unpack those dates for you as we go through this evening, so you don't need to worry too much about what are those dates. I'll outline them, and they are very clearly marked in the code itself. And again, I'll be showing you some screenshots to make sure that's clear as we move forward. Okay, so bird's eye view of the code. This is what it looks like, at least from a topics and requirements standpoint. We have 7 core sections that we're going to cover here at some level of depth this evening. That comes up to 103 requirements, many of which have not changed. So you might sit there and go, whoa, that's a lot of changes. The point is that in many cases, we're talking tweaks, some minor changes. And yes, of course, in some cases, we have some more significant changes. And that's where I'm going to focus our time and effort on this evening. But I want you leaving here with an understanding of the breadth and depth of the code, okay? So when I talk about those 7 core sections, I'm talking about everything from training and responsibilities, which is a new section you would not have previously seen in the 2009 code. Moving on to facilities and housing. You saw in the scientific report that we specifically focused on priority welfare issues around indoor systems, trying to understand what's the science say, what's the practice expectation, and so on. We then, of course, moved to some of the basics. Feed and water, husbandry, management practices, essentially. We're going to get into cattle health, preparations for transport, and euthanasia. And you can see in the sub-bullets here, I've outlined the number of requirements that have been created under each of these specific topics. Okay, so what's changed? Enough talking about the background. By the way, the reason I'm offering that background, the who, why, what, where, when, how, is because I want you as an advisor to be able to communicate on with your producers about how this came to be. Inevitably, regardless of how much outreach we do, we will have people say, who's making these decisions? They're probably a bunch of people in rooms that have never stepped foot on a dairy farm. Or we can all appreciate we hear some opinion around that. I think it's important that we share that this was not only a very systematic process and one that was meant to focus on being science informed and bringing a variety of stakeholders to the table, but I want you to understand that farmers had the chance to provide feedback at every step of the process, as did you as advisors, and were represented within these rooms and these subcommittees. So I think it's important that we share, how did this come to be? Why is it important? What are we doing with this information, and how is it going to inform things like ProAction or conversations that you as an advisor are going to be working with your farmers to support them on? So the why for me is really important, not just on the individual requirements, the science behind them, but the why behind this whole process: ProAction, quality assurance, the code of practice. Why do we have these things in industry, and what relevance do they have to an individual farmer? For me, there's some important merit in having that conversation before you start getting into a specific requirement. I've taken a bit of a consistent approach here, if you will, in many cases where we're going to talk about requirements. So let me just briefly set the stage for you here. Here I'm showing you the first section of the code of practice, which is training and responsibilities. When there are relevant requirements that I want to unpack for you, opted to take a screenshot of the actual code. So if you click on the link that Brooke in the chat has provided to you and look at the code, you're going to see requirements that look exactly like this. This is the verbatim wording of requirements in this particular section. I want you to become familiar with the visual expectations or format that the code has developed. So this is just a subtle cue to make sure what I share with you now is relevant when you go and peruse a rather large code and sift through what are some of the requirements. Okay, so you're going to see the yellow highlighting here. Specifically, when it comes to training and responsibilities, we have three requirements that are outlined. They're right here. Personnel must be aware of this code of practice and must follow the requirements of this code of practice. Again, I've already told you that's going to be the accountability measure there is going to be predominantly through proaction. It's perhaps important to know that some provincial ministries of agriculture are going to be using this to understand our bare minimum expectations being put in place on Canadian dairy farms. So if there was ever a need for an investigation, for example, that was certainly something that they would reference and look to. What's the code of practice say our expectations? Our second requirement is that personnel must have the competence to carry out the procedures that they're responsible for. It's important to perhaps define competence. You can see it here with the little asterisk. Competence in the context of the code is having demonstrated skill or knowledge in a particular topic, practice, or procedure that's been developed through training, experience, or mentorship, or a combination of all of those. In short, we're not suggesting, this code is not suggesting, that dairy farmers need to go sit in classrooms, they need to be certified or educated on any particular practice, at least based on what the code is written here. What they're saying is, look, producers do much of this every single day. In some cases, all of us require some form of continuing education or additional education. So there's going to be merit for some of those pieces, but training, experience, mentorship, or a combination of those are going to be sufficient and adequate when it comes to definition of competence. The final piece is that managers need to supervise personnel and retrain them if practices begin to fall below standards of care. Those standards of care are going to be outlined in the rest of the code. So we'll walk through those as we move forward. Why do we have this? Ultimately, we know, and there's good evidence to suggest this, and many of you through experience will appreciate this. Knowledge, attitudes, beliefs are what drive actions on farm, and they do influence welfare outcomes. This is about making sure that farm owners and managers who are responsible for their staff and the outcomes associated with their animals are able to do the job, are managing the people responsible for doing the job because they, at the end of the day, have the responsibility for the outcomes associated with that farm. So this is really about making sure training and responsibilities are in place. I'll also just briefly comment that this is a very common expectation globally as we look around the world to other dairy industries and see what kind of expectations their customers, their supply chains have. We almost always nowadays see some expectation, some question around training, retraining, and responsibilities. And so it's not surprising, perhaps, to see this now be integrated into the code of practice for Canada. What's your opportunity as an advisor? I think there's a couple of things. We have many veterinarians here, and of course, I'm not telling you anything new here, but establishing and maintaining your VCPR, your veterinarian client-patient relationship, is going to be one of many ways that you're going to help to support that mentorship, that training or retraining as needed. You play an important role when it comes to this entire section of this code. You and many of other advisors who are not veterinarians can offer services and support, whether it's developing, reviewing, and training on standard operating procedures that we see implemented or have expectations to be implemented on an average farm. We could consider, and I encourage you to consider recommending an on-farm welfare policy or code of conduct. This is something that we're seeing more and more again around the world in terms of expectations. I'm not suggesting this is a requirement. I'm saying this is a nice to have. It helps to, from an HR perspective, provide clear expectations for all parties involved on an individual farm, what the expectations are when it comes to welfare, management, or overall care of the animals on that farm. You could even support in tracking, training, and continuing education. Again, something that we see a lot of expectations around the world around these days in terms of what's going on the farm when it comes to continuing education. In short, as an advisor, I think you have a real opportunity to ask questions, to respond to those questions in the moment, but also to perhaps find opportunities to support your producers in more formal training or upskilling if that's of interest to them. When we go into the next section of the code, we get into facilities and housing. There are a lot of requirements in this particular section, and it's important to understand that there are several unchanging requirements, and there are some that have some specific changes. Here are some bullets I'll call out and just comment on as we go forward. Again, if you were to look in the code, you would find a number of areas here that were pulled out in yellow. They would say requirements, and a couple of these bullets would be found as you go through each subsection of this particular area, facilities and housing. When it comes to electrified crowd gates, they are simply not acceptable as part of to be used on a dairy farm. So plain and simple there. We will now see, and you will now see inclusion of the words ability to groom when you see some of the housing expectations. About midway down on this screen here, there is a section, many of you will be familiar with it. We have the expectation that cattle are going to be able to stand up, lie down, turn around, stand fully upright, and in this case, we now see in in this new code grooming themselves, as well as things like visual contact and adopting normal resting postures, having adequate bunk space. So we're talking about all of the circumstances or characteristics of the housed environment, making sure that these are appropriate. So ability to groom has been added here. That's really what I'm trying to outline. We also see in our third bullet point here, heifers and lactating animals are expected to have contact with other animals, right? So we expect groups of animals with direct contact opposed to some of the young stock, which I'll speak more on in a few moments. We have the expectation again, not dramatically changed, that special needs areas are available on the farm and that bedding is provided in those areas. Of course, it's going to provide good traction, soft environment, better for recovery, that kind of thing. As we talk about facilities, the expectation I've commented already around many of the provisions we expect for individual animals, but they need to be well maintained, in good condition, appropriate ventilation, trying to prevent trips, slips, and falls, those types of pieces, in addition to all of those standing up, lying down, turning around characteristics that you see written out here. The expectation is for all age classes of animals that they will be provided with bedding. And when it comes to electric trainers, the expectation is just a little bit more precise. We're talking about that they're only available for training or retraining purposes, that they must be safe, secure, adjustable, and appropriately positioned. Okay. And there's lots of detail out there in terms of some of those details around appropriate voltage, positioning, where we expect that to be, and when we expect them to be on and used, and when we don't. So those are some of the details that, for the most part, haven't changed, or I would consider some of these to be more tweaks as it relates to some of the 2009 change requirements, rather, that are going to carry forward and be relevant for us moving forward in the code. However, of course, there are some more significant changes, four in particular in this section that I want to talk about: pre-wean calf housing, calving area, freedom of movement, and stocking density. So this is what we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about here. Let's talk about pre-wean calf housing, perhaps one of the bigger ones. So in the requirements here, there's an important underlined bit because there's going to be a couple of slides I need to unpack for you here. First, for all calf housing systems. So these pertain to everything regardless of how you house your pre-wean calves. First, again, I've already talked about this first requirement. Housing must allow calves to easily stand up, lie down, turn completely around, stand fully upright. What we're talking about there is without touching the top of the enclosure, be it the hutch or whatever, adopting sternal and lateral resting postures, grooming themselves, and having visual contact with other cattle. So you see a tweaking of the word or some additional words in here, but by and large, we're not seeing a dramatic change to this requirement from what we've previously incorporated. The second bullet talks about the bedded area for group house calves, and it's saying it must be large enough to allow all calves to rest comfortably at the same time. Really not too different than the expectations of the first bullet. And now here's an important piece. Where tethering of calves is permitted, and I'll talk about when it is and it is not permitted in a moment, the tether must include a collar. So we can't just have a chain or a rope wrapped around the calf's neck. We need to have a collar on the neck and then our tether tied directly to that. Why are we talking about tethering? Why are we talking about freedom of movement? This continues to be one of the hotter button issues in terms of a focus from both a welfare and a customer or consumer perspective. So, society as a whole and our supply chain are asking questions about freedom of movement and where we have restricted forms of movement. We see the EU, for example, banning tethering outright. We have not chosen to take that approach here in North America, not just in Canada. And so we have a few different provisions. And of course, this is the subject of quite a bit of research at the moment around freedom of movement, not just for calves, but for all age classes of animals, trying to understand what the impact of additional opportunities for locomotion are, for example. And we're seeing more and more Canadian specific research coming out around the welfare benefits associated with that. One nice comment I'll also make as you look into the code itself is you'll see some detail that's written right into the code, not just in the scientific report, on what we know about the science behind some of these practices. In short, the justification behind why they're here. I want to draw your attention as I change the slide here to that underlined piece. We're now talking about indoor calf housing specifically. The first note is essentially forget everything I just talked to you about tethering. Calves must not be tethered as part of normal indoor housing. Okay, so if you have a calf barn, if you are housing your calves inside, tethering is not an option for you. Producers raising their calves individually are expected to develop a plan to transition to pair or group housing methods, so social housing, two calves or more, in consultation with a veterinarian or an other qualified advisor. So we're looking at everyone in this call is going to be some of the champions, some of the people you're actively being called on here to consult and support producers in finding a way to go from individual indoor housing to a group or a socially housed situation. Now, the reason we have this expectation to develop a plan is we're trying to socialize the idea that the third bullet is coming. Effective April 1st of 2031, calves that are healthy, thriving, and compatible must be housed in pairs or groups by 4 weeks of age. Okay, so it's important to break a couple of things down here. Healthy and thriving. If we have calves that are poor doers, if they are ill, if there's an outbreak of a disease, something like that, this is not expected to hold true. Those animals, those calves benefit from, in some cases, isolation, additional treatment, additional TLC, if you will, and can be removed from a social setting. But if we have calves that are doing well, they're thrifty, they're healthy, they're vibrant, vigorous, all of those good things, then the expectation is that by 4 weeks of age, they're going to, at minimum, be paired if they are in an indoor environment. When I talk about compatible, or when they talk about compatible, what they're getting at here is specifically if we have a very small farm and we're going to have major differences and discrepancies in the calves that would have to be paired together. We've got one calf that's 4 weeks old. We've got another one that's 7 weeks old. They're going to be incompatible. Okay, so there are going to be some caveats here, or at least that's my understanding of how we can use that healthy, thriving, compatible to inform whether or not we actually adhere to 100% of the time, without exception, the must group together by 4 weeks of age. It's not so hard and fast. We need to be practical. We need to be pragmatic. And of course, the goal of this is to capitalize on the welfare, health and welfare benefits that a fair body of work, body of science has demonstrated we can achieve if managed well. But of course, if things go wrong, in a particular instance, for example, the expectation is not to hold steady to that and potentially cause more morbidity or potentially mortality in those instances. It's to be pragmatic, to manage that situation, get back on our feet, and then go back to implementing this type of approach. I talked a little bit about the body of evidence that's surrounding and supporting this type of requirement. There's quite a substantial amount. This is not an emerging topic per se. This is not something that's new exploration when it comes to research. It's long been studied, and we've even a meta-analysis has just come out in a couple of months ago here talking about what we know from a synthesis and integration of a number of papers. Research continues to demonstrate benefits to calves raised in pairs or groups, ranging from everything from better growth to better social development, whether that's fear and learning. So we see them that they're actually less fearful as growing up in pairs. They are more inclined to learn, so they start getting on starter earlier when offered, for example, as a result of that social interaction that they have with calves. This practice is also much more socially acceptable. That's not always governing our changes, but it's nice to know that not only are we doing something that aligns better with our understanding of health and welfare science, but it aligns better with our supply chain and our ultimate customer, our consumer base, in terms of their expectations. So, if you find yourself having clients that have a system or a situation, what you see on the left-hand side of the screen, we see an indoor environment that is individually raising calves in individual setting. At minimum, they need to pull out one of those partitions by 4 weeks of age in order to group them together or pair them together in that instance. Or, of course, we could see something like on the right-hand side where they go much more to a group system. And there's quite a bit of research and now resources being developed on how to do that transition and what's optimal in terms of group size and a variety of other factors, which we'll provide opportunity to talk about here in a few moments. I also want to talk about outdoor housing. So I just covered indoor housing. Remember, the keys here is that you cannot tether. You must come up with a plan to transition to social housing. And by April 1st of 2031, it's expected that by 4 weeks of age, you will in fact socially house compatible, thriving, and healthy calves together. As we move to outdoor housing, so this could be hutches, this could be anything else, coveralls, and so on, there's a couple requirements specific to them. Calves housed outdoors, including in hutches, must have physical contact with another calf unless they need to be separated for health reasons or they need to be protected from inclement weather. So again, trying to be practical about the fact that if there are health issues, if Salmonella Dublin is running through the farm, the nose to nose contact is the worst thing that we could have. And so we want to be practical. We don't want to hinder the farm's ability to manage that kind of outbreak and make it worse. We can, for a time, forget about this expectation and do what's right for the animals and right for the farm. Same goes with inclement weather. Okay. Otherwise, the expectation is that physical contact is provided. I expect that as ProAction develops out their requirements, they're going to have a better definition for what physical contact is. It's not provided here. Is that nose to nose contact? Do they need to have a certain amount of physical contact? I'm not entirely clear on exactly what that's going to look like yet, but I suspect that's going to be provided in terms of guidance or expectation. The second bullet here is important. Calves may be tethered only if housed in hutches that provide access to an area outside of the hutch. So if I've got hutches such as on the left-hand side of your screen here, this would be perfectly acceptable from what I see for a couple of reasons. One, they've got collars on their necks, and if they're tethered, they can absolutely get out of that hutch. They have area to roam around, and depending on the length of the tether, they would be able to have some form of contact. This would, in my opinion, satisfy the requirements as outlined. We could also take an approach like we see on the right-hand side of the screen, where for a period of time we raise our calves individually in hutches. We put some wire fencing around them instead of having a tether, and then as they get up to 4 weeks of age, perhaps we extend the fencing around. In this case, 2 or 3 hutches, and we allow those calves to commingle. So both of these could satisfy the expectations in the code based on the specific setup or system that our farm is implementing. A couple of the other changes that are important to be mindful of pertain to calving area. Here we have requirements talking about calving areas, whether they're for group or for individual calvings, that have to provide the cow and calf with an area that's clean, safe, separated from the lactating herd, and that provides enough space for the cow to be assisted. Okay, so in the event of dystocia or anything like that, we can manage that environment, and that again, all of the things that we would typically expect from a best management practice, right? Clean, safe, making sure that they can be isolated or segregated as needed, certainly away from lactating animals is going to be what the expectation is here. You see now in the second bullet point in the requirements, effective April 1st of 2029, cattle on all farms must calve in loose housed maternity pens, yards, or pastures that permit them to turn around. Essentially, what we're talking about here is you're no longer going to be able to calve cows out in the tie stall. Okay, so we need to have a box stall or some other area that's going to provide them with sufficient space during calving. Newly built barns have to allow cows to calve in loose housed maternity pens that permit them to turn around. So essentially, if you're building a new barn tomorrow or you're going to finish those plans, the expectation is you're going to be able to provide this right away. If we have an existing facility and we're sort of grandfathering it in, then we're talking more about the expectation by April 1st of 2029. And we know from a variety of experiences and research that both calf and dam health and welfare outcomes are much better during calving they're more consistent and more easily managed in loose housed environments. Okay. And so we know that especially if we need to intervene in some way, shape, or form, it's going to be easier for us, easier for the calf, easier for the dam when we have space to do so, opposed to being tethered or being in a confined space or environment. So that's really the major thing that we're focused on there. Okay. So again, environments such as this, for example, a group housed calving pen on pack or an individually housed animal getting ready to calve is acceptable. That's what we're going for, and all of those other compete those pieces, characteristics around clean, segregated from lactating animals, hold fast in these types of examples. Okay. So, what's your advisor opportunity here? As with many of the requirements, I think the biggest thing first and foremost is your clients, their facilities. You could conduct a walkthrough of their facilities to ensure that they meet this or that they have the ability to meet this. But what we want you doing or thinking about perhaps is to consult with those who will need to make changes. First and foremost, making them aware of expectations and the timelines. The timelines are there to provide flexibility and essentially socialize or signal these are expectations that are coming, and we want producers to be able to modify their management and modify their facilities in order to adhere to these requirements by the date set. As an advisor, it's important you consider options to create enough space to create a box stall within an existing facility that might satisfy these expectations. So it's thinking a bit creatively. I don't think you need to instill that creativity in our producers. Most of our Canadian producers are very creative and willing, once given specific set of either obstacles, challenges, or goals, that they can find ways to manage. Your job here is to help facilitate that conversation, or to the extent that the producer would like that, I think there's the opportunity there to facilitate that conversation. Freedom of movement, of course, is another major talking point in industry. I'd say the global dairy industry, and not just dairy either. We talk about freedom of movement and confinement across all farmed animal species nowadays. Here, our requirements are threefold. First, we have a requirement talking about housing that must allow lactating and dry cows to easily stand up, lie down, adopt normal resting postures, groom themselves, and have visual and physical contact with other cattle. I restate that mostly just to signify not a lot has changed there. Like I said at the beginning, we just have that expectation for each age class of animal. We have those specific elements, and the new piece there really is grooming themselves. Our second bullet is the one we've heard probably more and more about. Effective April 1st of 2027, cows must not be tethered continuously throughout their entire production cycle. So that's calving to calving. They must be provided with sufficient regular opportunity for freedom of movement to promote good welfare. Again, there is quite a bit of research coming out about increased movement opportunity or freedom of movement, the ability to locomote. Will cows actually locomote more, and does that have meaningful benefits to them in a variety of ways? I think there's quite a bit of research that's continuing to look at provision of types of different types of outdoor access, for example. But it's not just outdoor. In fact, you don't see any expectation of outdoor access here specifically. The focus is on whether or not they have freedom of movement, right? So continuous tethering is what we're moving away from here. So newly built barns must allow daily untethered freedom of movement and social interactions year round. So the important point here is to say, look, if you have a tie stall and you are or managing that tie stall where the cow is in the stall 365 all points of the year, regardless of stage of lactation, you are going to need to make a change effective April 1st of 2027. You're going to need to find an opportunity to get those cows out of their stall and give them the opportunity to move around at minimum for some period of time that's sufficient within the lactation cycle. Newly built barns are going to need to adhere to this right away, and not just this expectation, daily untethered freedom of movement. So if you're building a new tie stall, you're going to need to provide daily access to move around outside of that stall. Okay. So again, the why behind this is we know increased movement opportunity through less restrictive indoor housing, for example, and or outdoor access improves dairy cow health, behavior, performance, and welfare. And there's a number of different studies that have looked at that. We summarize that specifically in the scientific committee report that we provided a link for, and you'll see some extra detail in the code of practice itself. Just navigating through my chat, Rachel, if an existing tie stall is expanding by adding on to the current barn, are they allowed to build more tie stalls in the new addition? I don't know the answer to that, Rachel, in terms of how ProAction is going to specifically address that. This specifically talks about newly built barns. If you're adding on to one, there might be that loophole there a little bit in terms of this is a bit different, adding an extension versus a completely new barn. I think it's pretty darn important though to talk to those producers that might be considering that and saying this is where we're moving as an industry. The change is not specifying this. Now, ProAction might have some more specific guidance on this as they work through these changes. I'm just going based on what the code is saying to us right in front of us on the screen here. But I think it's important to convey that as we move forward in time, the expectation is going to be providing more opportunity for movement to our animals. So I would really encourage them to think long and hard about what the approach is going to be and whether it's going to be sufficient for them in the long run. Okay, so I know that's not a perfect answer. I don't have all the answers at the moment in terms of how that's going to be dealt with. What are we defining as newly built, Hannah? I would think again, that's to Rachel's specific question. There is a new add-on. Is that new a new build? I would argue that you should be any new construction associated with whether it's a brand new tie stall or an add-on to a tie stall. You should be talking to them about the fact that it says as of now the code states newly built barns need to provide daily untethered freedom. So I think it's important. I'd be talking to them about that expectation. But again, we might need some more guidance from either ProAction, well, who will ultimately be responsible for implementing this requirement in place. Um, Mariev, oh, sorry, let me just follow back there. Freestall for dry off and tied the rest of the time is sufficient. We want 55 days minimum. That's so yes, Mariev, that's exactly right. I've got it on a slide here. The 55 days piece I can talk about. Damien, what regular opportunity for freedom really means? What's regular during the lactation phase? Yeah, so let me talk to you here because this will probably help answer it here. So we're first and foremost, I'm asking or I'm suggesting you consult with your clients to confirm who might not meet these requirements. So Rachel, your comment there around, hey, they're adding something on, what's the approach they're taking? The expectations and timelines for those who don't meet them. The current minimum expectation is that cows are offered opportunity for movement a minimum of 15% of the days of the year. So around 55 days. That's how they came up with 55 days. Okay. And then that's weather and conditions permitting. So generally, we're trying to be reasonable. Um, and then exercise periods per day must be a minimum 1 hour. Okay. And so we're trying to give them a meaningful opportunity to get out, to move around, and then we can get them back into their environment if we're going to do that, opposed to say in a tie stall that's got getting them out into a pack, then they can they may not need to provide that 1 hour minimum. They're simply going to be there for the dry period. So that's something to be aware of. I want you to consider whether indoor facilities can be modified to offer a loose housed area that could be used at minimum during the dry period. I think that's probably what we see more as a standard approach, right? Opposed to, again, no one's suggesting here that the bare minimum expectation is they need to get outside, but you might also consider are there options to get cattle outside for periods of time, an exercise yard, out on pasture for a period of time. And of course, if you're going to do this, we as a group need to be mindful of environmental regulations, okay, and particularly in provinces like Quebec, where we have expectations around some of those things. Just looking at my chat here. Yeah, I hear you, Rachel. So they're not in a position to tear down and build a brand new freestall. That's the long-term intent. And so the approach here is to add on, probably presumably for growth, to sort of manage between where they're at now and where they intend to go as they get into a loose housed environment. So again, I think that conversation, I mean, I'll have that conversation, perhaps follow up with you, Rachel, with a few folks and see if I can give you a better answer. I'm sorry I don't have one now as in terms of like specific definition. But again, going back to that story, bear with me for just a moment. If I go back one slide, again, the piece here is that newly built barns need to allow daily untethered freedom of movement. an add-on like that where I guess my initial reaction is to say it's carrying on with the management that's associated with the primary facility that you're doing. So long as it's not a separate independent build, then I would have been inclined to say that they must align with the middle bullet here. They basically need to do what by 2027 they need to provide some period of time, 55 days, untethered. But I will follow up to see if the definition of newly built barns is different, and perhaps I've misunderstood the application there. So I'll follow up and get back to you, and perhaps Vicky, we can email everybody with that response, so not just Rachel gets that feedback. And then stocking density is another one that we're seeing some changes associated with requirements here. Stocking density must not exceed 1.2 cows per stall in freestall systems. Okay, so we're talking no, we can't exceed 20% overstocking. But now we see some tiered expectations. Effective April 1st of 2027, we see stocking density must not normally exceed 10% or 1.1 cow per stall. Okay, and over as we extend on in time, effective April 1st of 2031, stocking density must not normally exceed 1 cow per stall. So we're working our way to a 1 for 1, or at least being potentially being understocked if you really wanted to, but 1 cow per stall is the idea there. When we're talking about a pack environment, resting areas and group pens must provide at least 100 square feet per Holstein cow. You see a couple of footnotes here. It says in the first one here, number two, actually, it says at any time during or after the 2027 or 2031 transition periods, stocking density can go up to 1.2 cows per stall, but only temporarily or intermittently. So it shouldn't be their standard, but if for some reason they need to overstock back up to that sort of 20% mark of overstocking, that is acceptable for a period of time. It just cannot be their standard. We need to be working through the 2027 and 2031 expectations. And again, this minimum required space allowance is based on average weights for large breeds such as Holsteins and will be adjusted for medium and small breeds. So you can expect more detail or more guidance coming out around this as ProActions integrates these requirements into ProAction itself. Why are we talking about this? I mean, again, as advisors, you'll know and appreciate research consistently demonstrates that from measures of lying behavior, most notably lying time, they're improved when lying space is increased. Beyond reducing competition, understocking is going to allow subordinate cows to avoid lying beside a dominant cow, get access to feed, those types of things. So it provides the necessities for those animals and that herd as a whole. And we can also appreciate, and I think there's good data to suggest that as we get up into consistently overstocking, and our production and some of our other welfare metrics improve as we actually reduce the rate of overstocking in many cases. And so there's important productivity and welfare benefits associated with trying to be much more close to that 1 to 1 type of stocking density. So those are the expectations that have been put out there. Frank, why 1 stall per cow in a well-designed robot barn? Is a question I commonly get. The cows are not lying down more than 14 hours a day. Is there science to say that lying time is impacted negatively in a robot barn with less than 1 stall per cow? I don't know, Frank, if I can't think of a specific study, not that I'm the world expert on this, but having looked at some of the papers, I'm not sure if that specific question's been asked. I mean, by and large, we typically do talk about that sort of 12 to 14 hour range per day, like you say, and perhaps there is something there is something to that experience. But I believe here the idea was to be a little bit more consistent around agnostic to facility. In loose house environments, the expectation is 1 to 1. And that's what they really signaled as being important for as a code development committee, and that's what they sought to achieve consistently, regardless of facility type. What will happen to dairy producers who don't have the necessary cash flow to meet the requirements? Profit margins shrunk with the high interest rates. Totally understand that, Elaine. I think the big thing there is so in terms of outcome, if you don't meet a requirement, that's ultimately going to be baked into the accountability framework or the corrective action framework that ProAction has set out. That is what the animal care, biosecurity, and food safety technical committees are working on as of now. So we don't have a clear answer on exactly how ProAction is going to deal with non non-conformance or non-compliance with this specific requirement. The reason for setting out these dates a little further in advance is to try to signal to industry and give producers the opportunity to change management. I appreciate not everyone's going to be able to invest in changing their facilities, but they may need to find ways to get rid of or lower the number of cows they have in a particular pen in order to achieve this and think through modifications to their facility in the longer term if that's what they need to do. So the expectation is that they would find a way, be it managing their animals, changing their facilities, or a combination of both, in order to adhere to the expectations that the code and then ultimately ProAction will set out for Canadian dairy farms. When we get into feed and water, there's a couple pieces here that are a little bit more, not straightforward, but I think more consistent. The feed and water expectations around for requirements emphasize the keys that you know well. Taking corrective actions on underconditioned cows as defined with a body condition score of less than 2.0, offering a palatable ration that meets nutritional needs, implementing a gradual weaning. This has been a change that's a little bit more specific. So we're talking the expectation is an implementation of gradual weaning, which takes place at a minimum of over 5 days, and ensuring that calves are at least 8 weeks of age before weaning is completed. So those are the targets, the expectations: 5 day minimum gradual step down weaning, and they must be at least 8 weeks of age before weaning is completed. We also expect that animals are going to have, of course, access to fresh, clean water, and they call out the fact that ice and snow are not going to be viewed as acceptable sources of water. Okay, so they need to be provided with water separate from those. When we get into pre-weaning calf milk feeding, this is, of course, another area that we see. I've already talked about high planes of nutrition a little bit. This is where we see that expectation actually be written out. First, we see calves must receive a diet that promotes them being satiated and maintains health, growth, and vigor. We then have that very meaty second bullet point that talks about the fact that newborn calves need to be offered a minimum total daily intake of 15% birth weight. For Holsteins, that would be roughly around 6 liters. And then from a week of life onwards to about a month of age, they need to be offered a minimum total daily intake of 20% birth weight. So again, roughly 8 liters for Holsteins. And that's a whole milk replacer. The idea here is to get on higher planes of nutrition. Higher planes of nutrition are associated with a variety of benefits. Before I talk about that, I'll just briefly highlight too that again, this is not a major change from the last code. The quantity of milk or milk replacer offered to calves at risk of cold stress must be increased, right? So trying to get more calories into those calves in particular to help them when their thermoneutral zone is being challenged. Why are we doing this? There is gobs of evidence around this in particular. This has been a subject of intense research over the last decade, if not quite a bit more, asking this specific question around high planes of nutrition. Research is consistently demonstrating better health. What I mean by that is lower levels of diarrhea, so lower incidence of diarrhea, improved immune function, reduced treatments for diarrhea in particular, but some respiratory disease as well, and improved recovery for diarrhea when we get calves on feeding or eating rather 20% birth weight or more. We see better welfare outcomes as well. Reduced cross-sucking. I talked about that already. We see increased play behavior, reduced vocalizations, and non-nutritive oral behavior. All of those are suggestions that the calf is feeling better, essentially, and we're seeing that in her behavior. And we also see better productivity benefits as well. Higher pre-weaning growth rates, feed efficiency, first lactation milk production, and in earlier age at sexual maturity. In short, feeding more milk pays in a variety of different ways. It pays us back in terms of the farm. It pays us back in terms of the cows and the calves. And so this is what the science is generally outlined, and this is how the code has adopted or integrated that science into their expectations. When it comes to husbandry practices, there's a whole list of them here. And again, I'm trying to kind of illustrate here because we don't have time to go through everything, that it's emphasizing the keys, making sure our farms are using low stress cattle handling techniques, that electric cattle prods are only going to be used in extreme situations and with care and never in sensitive areas in the udder, in the anus, in their face, for example. Of course, calling out that abusive handling is going to be unacceptable. When it comes to down cows, we still haven't seen a lot of changes here, but calling out the importance associated with movement in particular. So the use of hip lifts can only be used for a short duration and, of course, for lifting only, not for movement. Using any apparatus according to the manufacturer's instructions. Okay, so not getting too creative with some of these tools. And again, prod use in consultation with a veterinarian. So specifically calling out in an SOP, if we're going to be using a prod, how, when, and where is it appropriate to use that prod, and how do we make decisions associated with the animal not getting up, having used that prod. When it comes to surgical procedures, of course, that's going to be in consultation with a veterinarian and or performed by a veterinarian, depending on the surgery in question. Branding is outlined as not being acceptable, period. When we refer to disbudding, we're talking about the fact that it must be done by 8 weeks of age with the local block and an NSAID. Okay, so there's no changes there. That same proaction requirement that we see today is still holds true. Banding dehorning is specifically called out as not being acceptable. Okay, so that's the one method that's called out as not being acceptable there if we're actively removing horns. When it comes to castration rather and supernumerary teat removal, it needs to be done as early as possible and with pain control, but we're not being as specific here. Tail docking is not acceptable unless medically necessary and requires pain control when being performed. So I know I've gone through those quickly. The reason I've gone through them quickly is many of these haven't changed or just really been minor tweaks. For the most part, these husbandry practices stand fast as the consistent pieces that you see baked into the previous code, and many of them called out in ProAction specifically, such as pain control, for example, ban on routine tail docking, SOP expectations, minimum required elements associated with down cattle movement or handling more broadly. As an advisor, of course, you know many of these topics well. In fact, it calls out some of you as advisors directly as veterinarians. Many of these are going to be consistent with best practice, and many of them are going to be implemented on farms today because they were requirements or expectations set out in the code. And forgetting about the code for a moment, these have been standard practice, I'd say, for many farms for years. And of course, if they are not, there are opportunities for improvement. There are certainly several key training opportunities. I think there is no such thing as overtraining when it comes to cattle handling and low stress approaches to doing so. And down cow management, thinking through a variety of scenarios and what are we going to do if she goes down in a pit parlor? What are we going to do if she goes down at the end of a row in the final stall in a tie stall? How are we going to manage? Who's my down cow support team? Who am I going to work with to deal with those situations? I think asking questions and facilitating conversation is an opportunity all of you have at your fingertips, especially having relationships with your producers and being trusted advisors. And of course, continue to espouse the importance of appropriate pain control being provided regardless of method and really animal health practice. Cattle health is very similar. I'll call it a couple of things as I just briefly talk about a few of the pieces here. Again, we're emphasizing the keys, right? So asking our farmers to establish a VCPR and maintain that VCPR, that vet client patient relationship. We have disease events, treatments, and mortalities we expect to be recorded and kept for at least 3 years. So we're trying to promote and advocate for more consistent and detailed record keeping for a variety of reasons, whether it's antibiotic stewardship associated with treatments, mortalities, treatments, and disease events are, of course, going to be important when it comes to trying to monitor and understand trends associated with health management, the effect of our interventions or our treatments, and guiding you as an advisor to be more of a resource for your producers. Health records, of course, are meant to be reviewed, and if they're well kept, they can certainly aid you in doing your job more efficiently and effectively. So we're calling that out as a requirement and an expectation here in the code. Prompt care for sick and injured cattle. Nothing's changed there. Appropriate care for down cattle. Again, some of those key aspects that we expect. So, provision of feed and water, protection from the elements, separation from ambulatory animals, for example, being some of those key pieces. When it comes to cattle close to calving, we want them monitored daily and, of course, at appropriate intervals based on where they're at. Corrective actions are expected to be made in consultation with a qualified advisor if pre-weaning mortality, defined as being more than 2 days of age within the pre-weaning period, is greater than 10%. So they've chosen that number in particular, not as a call out and saying this is what optimal is or suggesting this is what should be done. They are specifically outlining this as a requirement. If you exceed 10% mortality in the pre-weaning period, the expectation is that you're going to implement or work with an advisor to develop and implement corrective actions to address that. Colostrum basics, 4 liters of colostrum within 12 hours, and the first feeding as soon as possible and within 6 hours. Frank, is 4 liters of colostrum regardless of size of calf or quality of colostrum on every calf? No, this is again going to be modified according to breed. So what you see here is me just calling out what we typically say is industry standard for Holstein. And of course, if we're talking for jerseys or smaller breeds, we would see a modification of that, right? So we typically go to that 3 liters of quality colostrum within 12 hours. It tends to be that rule of thumb. So it's not setting out a consistent and one-time standard without considerations for breed. There's also a call out here around systemic analgesia for severe acute clinical mastitis. Okay, so they're calling out that expectation specifically. Those would be some of what I would feel as either some of the things that have stayed fairly consistent or some of the tweaks and changes that are important to be aware of when it comes to cattle health. Your advisor opportunity here, again, many of you are veterinarians, not all of you, but many of you. These are going to be consistent with what I would term many modern commercial best practices in Canadian dairy farms today. The question becomes, and I want to be asking as an advisor is, how are your clients doing when it comes to treatment records? Are they consistent? Are they capturing everything? Where's the opportunity for improvement there? How about mortality records, for example? These are expectations, they're requirements, but where are our producers at? And how can we help them make this more practical? How can we use that information to benchmark our clients, to inform their practices, to inform just conversation? What can we learn from them to help guide on-farm change here? And consider something like I've made this term up, colostrum audit, to explore management and successful transfer of past immunity. So, we know, again, I won't belabor the point, but we know that what we believe is clean may not be clean. We can use luminometers. We can assess colostrum quality a variety of ways, and not just colostrum quality, but our management practices wholly. So, are you pulling blood? Are you doing serum total proteins? Have you shown producers how to use refractometers, colostrometers, and so on to evaluate colostrum quality? Have there been opportunities for you to bring a few producers together to talk about colostrum management, for example? I've never not had a good conversation with a group of producers around colostrum management where there hasn't been at least one aha moment or a knowledge gap addressed by having some of what I would consider the basics to be discussed. The basics being quantity, quality, and timeliness associated with colostrum quality. But of course, we can get into many other pieces as well. So thinking through and perhaps creatively about your next group meeting that you might have with producers, whether it's a clinic meeting, whether you are a nutritionist on the call and you actively consult and bring producers together. There are a lot of topics here that have been baked into the code that present plenty of opportunity for conversation between producers, between advisor and producer. And I'd encourage you to try and position yourself to have some of those conversations early and often with your producers. Lameness and injuries is another important one, of course, because of the pervasive and chronic nature of lameness and injuries in commercial dairy industries, as well as because of the lameness productivity impact, sorry, the welfare and productivity impacts of lameness and injuries. So you see a number of requirements specifically called out here. Personnel must regularly observe cattle for signs of lameness or leg injuries to diagnose and treat them quickly. To minimize lameness and leg injuries, producers need to set thresholds for the occurrence of lameness and leg injuries and take corrective actions when the thresholds are exceeded. There is not more detail on those thresholds. I'm going to guess that there's going to be some integration here with the zones that we see in ProAction associated with animal-based measures that are already actively putting thresholds around, the red, green, yellow, dark red zones that we see in ProAction. So again, more to come on that, I suspect, in terms of guidance. But the expectation is here is that regardless of those zones that ProAction puts farmers into, the importance here is to understand how are you doing? And what are your opportunities to improve? When does corrective action need to take place? The expectation is also that feet and claws are going to be inspected and hooves trimmed as required to promote a normal gait and minimize lameness. So again, it's not being prescriptive on the expectation in terms of how frequently, but we want routine observation anyway, whether that's in the parlor, for example, spraying off hooves, taking a look at feet, getting a hoof trimmer in to do at least maintenance trims and of course corrective trims as needed are going to be some of the things we want to be thinking about. And again, how can we systematize this? How can we make this as a consistent procedure for our farmers to the extent that they may need support in creating more of a consistent approach? Of course, infectious hoof lesions need to be treated to control the infection, and so a variety of ways to do that and explore that. Therapeutic or corrective hoof trimming need to include strategies to relieve pain and pressure on the injured area and promote healing. So again, talking about blocking, talking about a variety of the treatments that our trimmers would be providing here. And pain control must be included in the treatment of cattle that receive an invasive hoof trim. Again, will there be more specific guidance or detail on defining that? That remains to be seen at this point. Hopefully, it feels rather intuitive in terms of if we're really going to be removing a lot of the horn on a particular claw, for example, if there is a serious infectious issue or ulcer, for example, that pain control is going to be provided. Vic, I don't have an answer for you right there in terms of are we talking about freezing the foot of an animal for invasive trim? I don't necessarily know that they've called that out specifically. It certainly could be an option depending on the circumstances, though. So in terms of time, I'm not going to break us out into another group just so I can keep us to time. I appreciate we're in the evening and everyone's evening is precious. Um, one thing I want to share with you though, and we'll share this by email after our presentation, is I'll share a couple of resources that we have created. The industry, I've created a few. I've showcased a couple of them already that walks through a little bit of what's causing lameness. Again, I don't mean to hit you over the head with things you already know and experience, but I am finding it increasingly interesting to see what kind of research is exploring not just what we know about the causes of lameness or how we detect lameness and the automation that's coming with AI and so on to evaluate it. All of that's kind of neat and interesting to me to look at. What I think is more important is talking about what do we know in terms of actual evidence-based recommendations to address lameness? What low-cost opportunities actually exist for improvement here? And perhaps most importantly, something that I'm particularly passionate about is a summary of what we know about producer mindset. What are the barriers holding people up to doing something more aggressive about lameness or injuries on farm? There's a fair amount of work that's been done in the research and in the academic literature in this space. And again, all of you as advisors are going to have experience in working with producers, perhaps telling them the same things over and over and not seeing a lot of change. We know that lameness and injuries take time to heal. They take consistent effort to identify and action ultimately to address. And so for me, understanding some of the mindset barriers associated with how to deal with these chronic issues in the facilities that we have today is really one of the most important things. So we'll share a few resources with you after the fact to hopefully inform some of the conversations you might have moving forward. And just in the interest of time, to drive on with a couple final comments from me before we wrap up. The advisor opportunity here for me is, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of opportunity, regardless of who you are on the call, be it nutritionist, be it veterinarian, be it hoof trimmer, knowing that those are some of our primary advisors represented here. You have a role to play when it comes to lameness in particular, right? Multifactorial disease, it incorporates elements associated with the cow, it incorporates elements related to the housing and certainly to management. And nutritional aspects, hoof trimming aspects, and animal health aspects all play a role. So, can you offer a third-party assessment to go through a visual observation? Can you leverage the animal care assessment data from ProAction, the assessor data, the assessor evaluation that's been done? Are you keeping records? Are producers keeping records of what they're doing, what they're identifying? Do they have a meaningful SOP and not just have the SOP, but are they acting on it? Are they following that SOP? And is it reasonably detailed enough to demonstrate the expectations there? A practice that I quite enjoy working with producers, in particular, I've done this quite a bit with nutritionists and veterinarians, and occasionally with trimmers, is benchmarking clients and supporting group-based discussions here. How collectively are we doing with respect to lameness and injuries on the farm, and what can we do about them? One project I'll briefly call out is a project I worked on with the University of Minnesota and Dr. Aaron Winan's work, who specifically explored creating groups that brought together the herd vet, nutritionist, and trimmer together for a solutions-oriented and farm-specific conversation on what can we do as a team to create a corrective action plan for lameness on this farm. Really interesting results in terms of the experiences of both the farmer and those individual advisors, who in some cases knew each other, in other cases had never spent time together, yet are all commingling on the same facility at different time points and influencing one another's work. In in short, find ways to engage with one another as advisors. We can offer more value as a team of consultants, of advisors to our producers if we do so. A few final sections to just briefly cover here pertain to, of course, preparations for transport. We're no stranger to changes associated with transport over the last several years, of course, with the transport regulations. And of course, the requirements here are going to tie in closely to those requirements. So first and foremost, we expect that Canadian producers are going to abide by transport regulations, right? So we expect that farmers are going to be assessing animals for fitness to transport for transport, that unfit animals are not going to be transported except for veterinary care and transported with special provisions, so extra space, bedding, and so on. Compromised animals are transported with special provisions and are going direct to slaughter, opposed to a commingling facility or to sale. Calves that are less than 8 days of age or 8 days of age are only shipped direct to their final destination, and that steps are taken to prevent risk of udder engorgement when shipping lactating animals. This is perhaps one of the most contentious issues that was initially brought up when the regs were being developed. Farmers saying very clearly, I need to be able to ship a lactating animal. And of course, government welfare researchers saying, okay, well, we need to understand, or we collectively need to find ways to mitigate the welfare issue associated with udder engorgement. If that animal is not going to be milked from when she leaves that farm to 5 days later when she's going to reach her final destination. So, what can we do to prevent the risk of udder engorgement when shipping lactating animals? And I'll reference a resource in just a moment to facilitate that conversation. Personnel involved in loading, unloading, and transporting cattle must have the necessary knowledge and skills. So it more speaks to that competency piece that I talked about before around roles and responsibilities. And everything from ramps, gangways, chutes, and steps need to be designed, constructed, maintained, and ultimately used in a way that prevents the animal from slipping, tripping, or falling, right? So this entire process from I've made the decision to ship her, she is fit for transport, or she is not fit for any type of transport, but she's compromised, and I need to provide special provisions. We need to make sure we are following through in terms of duty of care from quite literally leaving that holding area to getting onto the truck to facilitating and ensuring that she's going to be able to walk off the truck. And that's not just the farmer's responsibility, but their responsibility prior to that cow leaving the farm. That's very much going to be a core component of what they need to focus on. And I just call out here, of course, your classic decision trees that we see. This is an appendix within the code itself, talking about the distinction between is this animal fit for transport, yes or no. If the answer is no, the quick question is well, is she unfit or is she compromised? And we have a laundry list of definitions here or criteria that are going to help us put her into one of those two buckets, and then some caveats around special provisions. I'm not going to belabor this because this is really, again, tied to the transport regulations that have come into place and have been, I hope, socialized with all of you to a certain extent in our farmers around the country. So we don't see a lot of changes here. This is requirements for the basis of adhering to regulation. Your opportunity, of course, though, is to either support in reviewing standard operating procedures, discussing actions on farm. More and more, I'm finding that advisors are going to be texting with their producers. Send me a video of how she looks. I can help offer some insight into what I think on her, for example. Making sure people understand the definitions and confirming they're understood around unfit, around compromised, around special provisions. Those three in particular. Don't forget about young stock expectations. Okay, this is one of the important areas in particular. If they're going to be more than 8 days of age, where can they be sent? If they're less than 8 days of age, how do we manage that? Are we raising them out on farm? What are the expectations and criteria there? And ultimately, ask yourself, ask your producers, how are they preventing udder engorgement when shipping lactating animals? There are a couple of different resources out there. DFC themselves excuse me, have created a resource that walks through some of the steps around drying off cull dairy cattle, considerations essentially. Why is this important? What can you do? Things to think about. Approaches to take. You will now see in your chat a link to both an English and a French version of this fact sheet where you can access it directly. The last piece here gets into euthanasia, and of course, no stranger to being in the code, or for most of you veterinarians, a topic that you're going to certainly have be well versed in and talking to producers about. The key here is cattle with compromised conditions that are unlikely to recover and or not responding need to be promptly euthanized, and so that's being called out as a requirement, plain and simple. Personnel that are going to be responsible for these practices need to be trained and competent. Again, you see that word training, competency coming in and being integrated throughout, especially with sensitive or vulnerable populations. Of course, animals that are compromised or euthanasia is on the table are going to be fitting that bill. Acceptable methods need to be used here. We can look to the AABP 2023 guidelines to get a sense for some of these details. We don't need to look to that resource because they are baked directly into the code. We can talk about the use of a gunshot. We can talk about penetrating captive bolt. Of course, if we're using a captive bolt, we need to have a secondary step to actually cause death. So we're talking about pithing. We're talking about a second shot. We're talking about bloodletting. All of those are options. Drugs administered by a veterinarian, of course, controlled substance. So that's going to be something that you're responsible for. One of the things that's perhaps really important to call out for those of you that have not paid attention to the finer points of what we see in the AABP guidelines, the difference between 2019 and 2023 specifically, is calling out some distinctions around the use of the 22 and whether or not that's acceptable for euthanizing a mature animal defined as an animal that's of 6 months of age or older. A 22 long rifle is not sufficient to euthanize a mature animal. That's very clearly called out in the 2023 guidelines for ABP and is not as clear in the 2019 version. So I want to direct you to making sure you're aware of that. So a 22 Magnum or a higher powered or a caliber of weapon would be needed in terms of the use of a firearm for a mature animal. A 22 long rifle would be sufficient. Of course, always using solid point ammunition. A 22 long rifle would be sufficient for euthanizing a animal under 6 months of age. So be aware of that distinction. If you have clients that are using firearms, there will be some detail in it's very well laid out in the code, but these will be details associated with requirements around euthanasia. For me, euthanasia all starts with a conversation with your producers. Who's responsible for making these decisions? How do they determine if an animal needs to be euthanized? What are the signs? What are the decisions? What methods are used for adult and young stock? Specifically calling out the two differences there. Whether it's use of gunshot, do they have differential methods? I was involved in some research for the National Dairy Study a number of years ago in the around 2017, 2019 when we looked at the data on practices on farm of Canadian dairy farmers trying to understand what they were doing for euthanasia. And we saw roughly 7% of producers said, I use a different method. Now, this might have been a sign of the times as well, but they outright said, I euthanize bull calves differently than I do heifer calves. And so we're seeing different methods being differential treatment and different methods being used in some cases. And so we're calling out you can use different methods if you want, but they need to align with the requirements. Okay. And so that's important there. And if anyone's interested in the work that's been done on practices nationally around euthanasia, I'm happy to share some of the published work that we've completed there. Of course, I think it's also really important. We see this a lot in the audits that I'm supporting, conducting in North America. The importance of emphasizing the assessing unconsciousness and death, distinguishing between the two, making it clear as to why this is important and what it means to actually confirm death, not just unconsciousness, right? Being mindful also, I think, when having these conversations about the sensitivities, the stress, anxiety, potential discomfort that may be present. And I think in many cases, the situations that have been less than desirable when with respect to euthanasia at some level have been associated with some of the stress, anxiety, or discomfort around performing this procedure. Farmers get into farming because they want to be stewards of animal health and welfare, not to euthanize them. But of course, as one's responsible for animals, they're also responsible for the death of those animals, and making sure that's done in a appropriate manner. So in some cases, having conversations about this, I think, can be quite helpful. And there's some interesting work that's being done in places such as Quebec and a few others outside of Canada that are exploring some of the sociological impacts in pieces around euthanasia. So as an advisor, I think this is well within your purview, particularly as a veterinarian, if you're out there as a vet, to have these conversations if this is not something you've got really a good insight into today. For me, the bottom line here, folks, is the new codes introduce some important practices that's going to require Canadian dairy farmers to change management and facilities, right? Social housing is a big one. Stocking density might be a big one. Tethering and freedom of movement may be important for some of your clients as well. And of course, things such as how you're going to manage lameness, injuries, for example, may result in changes, bigger changes. The ripple effects may be bigger for some farms and maybe less for others. I'd say these changes are very much science-based and informed. They're in line with where the industry and society expects our industry to go, particularly over the next 10 years. I think that's important to understand. We have a lot of customers in Canada that are operating in a variety of other jurisdictions as well. And they're comparing and contrasting what we're doing in Canada with what the United States is doing or the European Union or so on are doing. And the code of practice, it needs to be evergreen for roughly 10 years. So this document, this exercise, is really about thinking and forecasting what are the expectations that we're going to need to have to put in place, the things that we're going to need to deal with. So the why here, why we have tiered timelines, you see 2027, 2031 called out in a number of areas, is both to try to signal to our collective supply chain partners that this is something we're moving towards, but we also, and very much embracing that continuous improvement mindset, but we're trying to enable our farmers to understand what the expectations are, why they're their expectations, and give them time to adjust. And part of this very real exercise that we're doing right now this evening is to offer them support and use support to create those conversations. Again, you're going to be much more influential. You are much more trusted than I am, for example, or than DFC is on an individual farm. And so for those reasons, you can have, I think, more informed, more practical, and offer more tailored conversations to your producers. They're going to need support, whether that's awareness, whether it's guidance, whether it's very specific consultation. There's a lot of, I feel, opportunity as advisors here, regardless of what letters you have behind your name, for you to leverage your relationship as an advisor to support your clients in continuing to improve. So I'd really think about that. If you're a vet operating in a multi-vet practice, for example, are there opportunities to bring producers together or to bring you and your colleagues together to talk about how are we going to be talking about some of these items at an upcoming meeting that you might be hosting for some of your clients? Could you bring them together and talk about changes in the code? Would it be beneficial to have some of the slides that we've shared with you tonight to facilitate that, for example? Are you in need of other resources that might help to facilitate conversation? Not just, this isn't just about you being informed so you can talk to your producers. Many of you have this already, but I want to call out the importance of also having and building in relationships and networks with the community that we have in this room right now. Reaching out to one another, talking about how you're going to deal with Rachel's question around a few extra stalls are going to be added in the tie stall. Is that newly built? Is that requiring daily untethered access, or is that much more around 55 days out of the year? Being able to share these questions, the comments, concerns, and the how-tos, the lessons learned, I think that's part of what a community of advisors is all about. And I'm hopeful that the Canadian Dairy Hub is going to be able to facilitate that moving forward. Last point from me is there's more to come. ProAction is going to find different ways to incorporate these requirements. As you've heard, they're going to go through a piloting phase. Rachel, perhaps the answer to that question right now is that's going to be a subject of our pilot. We need to talk about this, explore this, see how we're going to define newly built, for example. So expect more guidance and more information to come. We'll be keen to hear what your thoughts are, what your needs are, what questions there are, so we can respond and help you to the extent that you're interested in that moving forward. But for me, those are some of the take-home bottom line messages that I'd like you to understand right now. With that, I would just like to call out the session here was developed by Lactanet, was brought to you in thanks very much by the Dairy Farmers of Canada, and funding through the National Dairy Knowledge Transfer Project. Vicky, I'll hand it over to you for the last few minutes to comment on any final remarks. Last comment from me is just thank you to everyone for joining us today. I hope this was helpful to give you an overview of the code and some of the detail within some of the major changes and perhaps the opportunities as an advisor. I'd be happy to answer any questions as they come in through the feedback. We'll be reaching out with a few answers to the things that I wasn't able to properly and sufficiently address today, and always happy to have separate conversations if of interest down the road. So, Vicky, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you. Vicky, I'm not sure if you're there. I don't see you on camera and you're on mute. Oh, she froze. Perfect timing. Um, I can probably maybe help her there in the chat. She has posted a message asking for a quick final feedback survey. If you would be able to take a couple of minutes to fill that out, we'd appreciate it. It helps to inform what we're going to do next, how we can support you. And again, if you have any other specific questions, comments, or ways we can support you, we'd be very excited to do that. So thanks very much, everyone. That will wrap up our session for this evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in a future webinar with more information to come. Thanks, everyone.